Hello, everyone. We're looking at Book One of Plato's Republic here. It is really, in terms of the Republic as a whole, only a prelude, but a very important one. Main themes of the book are opened up here in Book One and in Book Two. We're reading part of Book Two as well. I would say that the best thing to do as you approach Book One of the Republic is read it and read it leisurely. Read it, let it. Okay. There's an introductory part, sets the thing up, the conversation, and it has no philosophical relevance whatsoever. Okay, but it's part of reading Plato to read these introductory parts where the characters meet, and as so often happens in a Platonic dialogue, the philosophical conversation begins naturally from ordinary conversation, and that's an important part of Plato, I think, and it at least sends us the message that for Socrates, talking philosophy is just part of ordinary life, something he did with his friends, and because philosophical topics came up. And so, what happens here? We have Socrates and his friend Glaucon, who happens to be Plato's brother or half brother. They run into some friends at the Piraeus, which is the port of Athens. I don't know, a mile or so from the city of Athens. I wouldn't know. Still there, Piraeus. Athens was a seafaring city, but the port was a little distance from the main city where Socrates lives, and they run into some friends. Polemachus, others. They're all listed here. And the important thing, I think, I guess, after this quite interesting little intro, which I think has symbolic meaning, if we were to read the Republic as a whole, might have symbolic meaning just reading Book One of the Republic, but and I think in fact it does. But in any case, things really get going here in this conversation when Glaucon, Socrates, and the rest of the group return to the house of Polemachus and his father's house, Cephalus or Cephalus. Let's call him Cephalus. And Cephalus is a rich older man who is very glad to see Socrates. And the first thing that Socrates notices, because he hasn't seen Cephalus in a long time, is that he's grown older. And that really becomes the basis of his conversation with Cephalus. And he asks him some questions about old age, which become questions about money. The question of whether old age is an affliction and whether it's easy or hard to bear old age. In Cephalus's mind, or not in Cephalus's mind, but in Socrates' mind, Socrates suggests that money might have a lot to do with whether your old age is hard or easy. So it gets into a discussion of wealth, and this is a interesting, I'd say, very important discussion about things, and Cephalus giving his advice really about money and age. And the main thing he says, which is quite interesting, and this is why I asked the study question I did, is at a certain point the thing becomes not only a discussion of age and money, but a discussion of justice. And that leads us into our main topic. And I believe that the first mention of justice is on page 4 here, where he quotes the poet Simonides, who says, "Hope cherishes the soul of him who lives in justice and holiness, and is the nurse of his age and the companion of his journey. Hope, which is mightiest to sway the restless soul of man." And in a very, I would say, surprising way, what Cephalus says is that Socrates asks him, what is the greatest advantage of wealth, of being wealthy? And Cephalus says the greatest advantage is that if you're wealthy, you have a clear conscience because you didn't have to do any injustice. And this is a great solace as you are getting older and thinking about death, thinking at the stories, he says, about the afterlife and about reward and punishment for how you lived your life. They sound a little bit more plausible as you get closer to death. So it is a great comfort that you don't carry any crimes of injustice on your conscience. The implication being that if you don't have money, you might actually need to be unjust to get by, which is an extremely interesting thing. And the way that Socrates responds to that is quite interesting too. And I want you to think about that. Where basically, well, Socrates asks him, well, haven't you implied that justice is speaking the truth and paying your debts? And is that always just? And so it's interesting because Socrates is clearly trying to draw Cephalus into a philosophical examination of the nature of justice. And Cephalus, who perhaps knows exactly what Socrates is like, says that, oh, I have to go now. I must go, for I have to look after the sacrifices. And he says the young men will discuss this. A great opening to it. And it's really a wonderful little vignette, little scene between Socrates and Cephalus on old age, money, wealth, and justice. But this switches to a more dialectically rigorous, analytically rigorous examination of the nature of justice between Socrates and, let's say, the third main character here who's been introduced, Polemarchus, who's Cephalus' son. And this is also extremely interesting, because the way that Polemarchus tends to think about what justice is a little strange to our ears. Basically saying that justice means treating your friends well and hurting your enemies, helping your friends and hurting your enemies, which, if I remember the first time that I read this, I was confused. Not confused, but I was, where did that come from? So I asked you the study question that I did. Who would ever think that the definition of justice, being a just person, was helping your friends and hurting your enemies or harming your enemies? But as I learned more about Greek culture, I think that idea, I began to be more familiar with it and realized just how strong it was in at least Athenian aristocratic culture. The idea that a real man, a man of virtue, you might say, the kind of man that Meno aspires to be, is one who knows how to help his friends and harm his enemies. It's a very political notion of what justice is. And the aristocrats of Athens, it was a democracy, but the wealthy, noble, aristocratic families typically took part in politics. They were the ones who traditionally did. So their notion of what it meant to be just was certainly influenced by that. So Socrates really doesn't like this notion that justice is helping your friends and harming your enemies, and doesn't like it so much that he leads Polemarchus to take it back, really, and to the point that not only is that not only are we not supposed to harm our enemies, we're not supposed to harm anyone, which is, again, not something that these men typically believe. They are typical Greek men, typical Greek aristocratic, ambitious men, and part of their ambition is to get ahead, at least in politics, if not in business. But that meant knowing how to help your friends and harm your enemies. So it's not given up easily. But one of the interesting things that Socrates says about justice is that if justice is a good thing, it couldn't possibly make anybody worse. And if you harm someone, you make them worse. So even if someone's your enemy, you can't make them worse through justice, because justice doesn't do that. Justice makes everybody better, the presumption is. So it's typical Socratic interrogation, what he does with Polemarchus, who was a good interlocutor, friendly, because he's willing to admit his mistakes. And Socrates, I think, shows him his mistakes or shows him his contradictions. And he's willing to admit, maybe verbally, if not in his heart, that the just person, or the just man, he's thinking, doesn't hurt anybody, doesn't harm anybody, does nothing but good. And And that's a very important admission, because it's at that point, when Polemachus admits that, perhaps reluctantly, that we get the introduction of the next, maybe fourth major character, and that's this character Thrasymachus, who is not a friendly interlocutor and has nothing but contempt for Socrates, and has nothing but contempt for Socrates' notion of justice that he's brought out.